Gaius Marius, Consul 82 BCE. The son of the legendary general and seven-time consul, Gaius Marius the Younger was thrust into political prominence as soon as he came of age. During the Social War, young Marius fought on the most active front and was later accused of assassinating his commander, a sitting consul, for daring to compare himself to the elder Marius. Marius Minor did much of the legwork when his father used the power of friendly tribunes to attain the command against Mithridates in 88. When Sulla marched on Rome, more than one Marius had to make a harrowing escape. Marius Minor ended up at the Numidian court, only to find that the king intended to detain him and use him as a bargaining chip. Seducing one of the king's concubines, Marius and his band escaped, reunited with his father, and returned to Italy. When the elder Marius supported Cinna, it was his son who presumably roused clients and took to the streets with arms to bash skulls. When his father died, the tension between Cinna and Sulla still promised to generate a civil war, and Marius, despite his youth, would prove to be a key player, as he commanded the loyalty of his father's veterans to a greater extent than any of the great man's other associates. Cinna died in a mutiny, and then Sulla returned with his army in 83. The following year, the new Marian leader, Gnaeus Papirius Carbo, sought to generate support and enthusiasm by naming the 27-year-old Gaius Marius as his consular colleague, some 15 years before he would be eligible under the traditional rules. Taking the field, Marius was heavily defeated at Sacriportus and forced to endure a siege at Praeneste. When both his own constant efforts at achieving a breakout and all outside relief efforts failed, Marius used his consular authority to order the deaths of his enemies back in Rome, including the Pontifex Maximus, who happened to be his father-in-law. His own escape through the sewer tunnels failed, and Marius's head ended up rotting on display in the Roman Forum. This is the story of a man who was, at heart, a less fortunate version of Pompey the Great. Gaius Marius the Younger had several important people in his life, but none of them loomed larger or had more influence than his father, Gaius Marius the Elder. The elder Marius was a novus homo from northeastern Latium. The family had never held office in Rome before, although they had been locally prominent in their home city. Plutarch was incorrect when he said that Marius' father was a laborer, since there's simply no chance that anyone could make that much money that quickly to go on to qualify for Senate membership. There is a chance, however, that his father did own a business of some kind that controlled a large number of mules. However, that does not by any means mean that the house of Marius was one that was a laboring family. Gaius Marius the Elder had grand ambitions despite being from a backwater, and although it was uncommon in this period for new men to achieve a whole lot in Roman politics, he was determined and extraordinarily talented, at least on the battlefield. And because of his combination of battlefield success and common touch, Gaius Marius was able to dominate the decade of the 100s, winning 6 consulships, including 5 consecutive. This was quite unprecedented, and a lot of what fueled his success was that he first defeated Jugurtha and the Numidians, and then went on to face off against the Cimbri and Teutones in northern Italy. The Romans had a dread of the Celts, or Gauls as they preferred to call them, and Marius was able to make up for a previous defeat by another commander and more or less literally slay the boogeyman. So his stature was immense in the Roman imagination. As for Marius's wife and the mother of the younger Marius, that would be Julia. So as the elder Gaius Marius rose in prominence, he was able to form a favorable marriage alliance with an established family, the Julii. This family was fairly minor by this point. They were not one of the leading families in Rome anymore. However, they could date their bloodline all the way back to the foundation of the Republic. And they also were slowly making a comeback. In fact, during the time of Marius's older years, we would start to see members of the Julii holding high office for the first time in centuries. And a lot of that probably was because of all of the runaway success that the elder Marius was having. By the time that Marius the Younger was born, around 109 or so, his father was already past the normal age for holding the consulship. Ideally, a noble would want to hold the consulship at the age of 42 or 43, but Marius was already 47 or 48. This was also a little bit old to be a first-time father, even by the standards of Rome. And it would only be a couple years later when Marius would achieve the consulship for the first time at the age of 50. And because Marius was now in the prime of his career and about to embark upon his dominance of the decade, this means that in the early years of Gaius Marius the Younger, he would not have seen that much of his dad. However, there were people he would interact with who were closer to his own age. He had two stepbrothers, Quintus and Gnaeus Granius, and they would still be around helping father and son in the 80s. There was also another nephew of Marius the Elder named Marcus Marius Gratidianus, and he may very well have been a neighbor or lived nearby at the time. So this was a childhood that had a lot of excitement, and after Marius's career started to slow down after 100, Marius the Younger got to get to know his father quite a bit better, and we have reason to think that they were relatively close. It's also been recorded in, I think, Appian, that Gaius Marius the Younger was actually a nephew rather than a son, and that he was adopted rather than related by birth. That might be the case, but if so, then based on Roman legal norms, that would be totally irrelevant, because an adopted son was just as good as a natural son in the eyes of the law. Up until the time that Marius the Younger was 9 years old or so, his father was by far the most eminent man in the city. During Marius's sixth consulship, however, he had been outmaneuvered by his political opponents and forced to employ the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which led to the destruction by force of two of his leading allies, Glaucia and Saturninus. This was most unfortunate. Both of those men were very effective at helping Marius maintain his standing, and without them, Marius was somewhat lost in the politics of the Senate. So despite his outstanding success, he actually was not terribly politically astute for the most part, outside of being popular with the common people and showing how good he was at command. Now, despite the fact that Marius had taken a step back and was no longer quite as popular as he had been, the fact remained that the name Gaius Marius was one of the most recognizable in Rome. Anyone who would run for office 20 or 30 years later with that name was bound to have strong name recognition. Also, it's worth mentioning that if any of your ancestors had held the consulship, you were considered a nobleman. So Marius the Younger would have had a very different energy than his father. And while people might have still looked at his father as being a mule driver, no one would say that about him. He grew up in Rome. His dad was wearing the purple when he grew up. So there was no reason to see him in that light. So he had the benefit of the name without having any of the stigma attached to being a new man. So things were looking great for Marius the Younger. And we can see that because his father is able to arrange for him to get engaged and later married to Licenia, who was the daughter of the Consul of 95, Lucius Licinius Crassus, who was one of the great orators of the age. In all likelihood, however, this engagement occurred after the death of Crassus, and so Marius the Younger would not have gotten to meet the great man in all likelihood, or if he did, it would not have been terribly extensive. Nonetheless, he would now be married into another of the great houses of Rome, and this would be quite advantageous for him when his political career eventually began. As for Marius the Elder, at this point, his political hopes are dashed. His ambitions still burn strong, but it's over. And it looks like he more or less had accepted that by the end of the 90s, until things suddenly changed. Until 91, there were three kinds of citizens recognized at Rome. You had full Roman citizens, Latin citizens and Italian citizens, each one of which had a different level of legal privilege. The problem with this system not only was that it was archaic and based upon how Rome had conquered Italy, but also that Roman citizens had superior legal status to Latins, who in turn were superior to Italians. This meant that, in practice, any court case involving a Roman and a non-Roman automatically resulted in a Roman victory in spite of the merits of the case. It also meant that when there was land redistribution, as happened under the Gracchi brothers, land would be taken away from Latin and Italian citizens and given to full Roman citizens. So this was a major problem, since military service was a shared obligation, and the Latins and Italians gave as many or more men to the legions when compared to full citizens. However, most politicians in Rome were opposed to granting this citizenship, because they knew that whoever's name was on the bill would gain a ton of clients and be politically really empowered. So they didn't want this to pass because it would have to pass under the aegis of one or another politician. The common people of Rome also didn't want this because they thought this would water down their legal privileges. One of the few things that they had going for them was that they had more status than the Latins and Italians. And so as this crisis continued to mount and pressure continued to build, there was only one man who was seriously promoting this, and that was the popular tribune Marcus Livius Drusus. And then he was suddenly assassinated. Now, to the surprise of many in Rome, but not to Drusus, the Latin allies all revolted. So all across Italy, there were revolts. This was a problem, because the normal Roman method for putting down revolts was to use brute force. And since they typically had better armed and larger legions, that was more or less a valid approach. However, the Italians had about the same, if not superior numbers, the same, if not superior levels of leaders, and they also had identical weapons and tactics. So this was going to be a long slog. And ultimately, of course, the Romans would have little choice but to grant the demands of their allies to end the war. This would also be the first time that Marius the Younger would find himself in combat. He was now 18 years old or so, and he would serve on the staff of one of the consuls during this conflict, as we'll see. And not only did he get to serve on the staff of one of the consuls, but he would be sent to the primary theater of operations. Without a doubt, the most active front of the social war was the so-called Marsic War, named for the Marsi. The Marsi were an Italian tribe who had aligned themselves with the Samnites in the 4th century, only, of course, to go on to lose the war and be reduced to allied status at the end of the 4th century. This meant that for a couple centuries now, they had been churning out men for the Roman Republic, and they had done so with fairly good success. At this point, in fact, they were most likely stronger and wealthier than the Samnites, and for that reason, they, rather than the Samnites, would be the major focus of the social war. Their chief leader, Quintus Pompeidius Silo, was actually one of the great organizers of this revolt, and he had been the one who was in Rome trying to petition for Italian rights. He'd actually been a friend of sorts to the late Livius Drusus. And because of his presence here among the Marsi, this was obviously going to be a major theater of operations. This also means that for the Romans, they would have to deploy their best commanders and largest armies in the theater. The Marsi were a dangerous opponent. Although they would only be able to sustain this war for a few years, they were a perfect opponent for Rome in many ways. They were almost fully Romanized, so a lot of Italic peoples had not fully abandoned their native language for Latin yet, but it looks like they were well on their way to doing that. So their coins no longer even had Oscan legends, they had Latin legends. This also means that because these men were conversant in Latin, they had a deep appreciation of Roman politics. Certainly, Pompeidius Silo did, and he used that to great effect. During the first full year of the war in 90, this front fell to one of the two consuls, Publius Rutilius Lupus. And we can see how important he was and how important this front was by the fact that among his legates was none other than Gaius Marius the Elder. This also, of course, implies that his 17-year-old son, Marius the Younger, would have been here as well, but we don't know with 100% certainty. But I'm going to go ahead and assume that he was here. Rutilius Lupus also had the services of one of the praetors, Quintus Servilius Caepio, and this front would prove to be quite deadly for Roman commanders. Rutilius Lupus died, killed in action. That led to the elevation of two commanders working together, Caepio and Marius, with the understanding that they would be colleagues. Of course, Caepio was jealous of Marius and tried to take all the glory for himself, got himself killed in an ambush, and after that it was just Marius. And the Senate was probably content to have a cautious and very experienced commander in charge after so many early defeats. And so, with all likelihood, Marius the Younger would now, for the first time, get to witness his father in battle. Throughout his career, the elder Marius had always been a defensive-minded commander, and here that mentality would very much serve him well. The army he had inherited was a bit disorganized and demoralized by the fact that they had lost two commanders in a short period of time, and that they were consistently on the losing side against the forces of Pompedius Silo. And so, Marius decided to adopt a kind of Fabian strategy, and to avoid big battles unless he could fight on his own terms. This proved to be successful, and a frustrated Quintus Pompedius Silo actually told Marius at one point, "If you are a great general, you will come down and fight me." But Marius, being the defensive-minded general he was, responded simply, "And if you are a great general, you'll force me to." Silo never forced him to. So Marius was able to win a couple of minor victories, restore morale, and then his time as a legate expired. He went back to Rome. New commanders came out. However, Marius the Younger would stay around, and he will now be a staff officer under the command of the two consuls, both of whom will be assigned to this theater together, Lucius Porcius Cato and Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo. As for the rest of the war, the Romans will win most of the battles, but they actually will never completely finish off the army of Pompedius Silo prior to when they simply grant citizenship. So technically, although Pompedius Silo will lose battles, he will not be completely defeated within the confines of the main phase of the war. And by the time that he is fully defeated, it will be because many of his men have deserted to go home and accept the new terms Rome is offering. However, in the meantime, there are still battles to be won, and in fact, most of the credit for this theater will ultimately go to Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, which is really how Pompey the Great, his son, will get his start because of the fame that his father will win from this particular campaign. But in the meantime, there's another incident involving the other consul, Lucius Porcius Cato, and one of his staffers, the younger Marius. So let's talk about that. It's now time to discuss the most infamous incident of this entire campaign, and indeed, really, of the whole war. The Lake Facinus incident. At one point during the campaign, Appian tells us, the consul Cato was very much feeling himself, and he decided to tell the troops before a battle that his own achievements now surpassed those of Marius, and they could follow him to victory. We don't really know how his achievements in the Marsic War stacked up against those of Marius, but the story goes that young Marius was certainly offended by that remark, and like many an ancient aristocrat, he decided that his feelings were best expressed through the point of a dagger. And so what he did was he waited until a battle happened not long after, perhaps on the same day, right around Lake Facinus. During the chaos and confusion of battle, where it was dusty and it was loud and it was hard to see or hear, young Marius supposedly was able to sneak up behind his commanding officer, cut him down, and then escape. Of course, this also cost the Romans the battle, and this defeat had to be retrieved by Pompeius Strabo, the other consul. As for the veracity of this story, the battle is certainly real. Cato died during the battle, and it's also probable that, like many Romans, he liked to brag. But beyond that, everything else is rather unlikely. Assassinating a general during a battle would have been extraordinarily risky, insofar as you were very likely to have gotten spotted and stopped by one of the lictors. So I have to dismiss this as almost certainly a later invention by anti-Marian Romans who were trying to really portray this young man as a temperamental monster, someone who was unfit for leadership. And so if I had to really date the origin of the story, my guess would be 82 BCE, when Marius served as consul, and Sulla and his allies were very much trying to diminish his name and reputation. Of course, other Sullans would have recorded this much later. Perhaps it was even in Sulla's memoir, and this was then found by guys such as Appian. That brief brush with command in 90 very much reawakened the dragon in the elder Marius. He knew that, sure, he was getting old and his time was short, but he still had one more great campaign left in him. And so, when news arrived that things out east had gone poorly, and that Mithridates VI of Pontus had attacked Roman Asia, massacred a number of Romans and Italians, and also defeated the efforts of Manius Aquilius and a couple other Romans to contain this Pontic invasion, Marius saw his opportunity, and he began to openly canvass for this upcoming command. So while Sulla and Pompeius Strabo were defeating the Italians, Marius was working out in the Forum and letting people see that he was still fit despite his age. We have to imagine the younger Marius was out there with him, perhaps working out as well, or telling people about how great his father was. In any event, the Senate did not give this command to Marius, but rather to the consul of 88, Sulla. There were only really 3 generals who had done anything of note in the war. Marius was the third of them. The second most important would be Pompeius Strabo, and the guy with the most success was Sulla. And so it made sense to give Sulla this command. Also, he was the consul of the year, so all of this aligned for him. But old Marius was still feeling froggy, and he had found new friendly tribunes to replace the ones he had been forced to murder 12 years earlier. And so one of them decided to get the command reassigned, and so now Marius would be the one to lead these forces against Mithridates. Except that rather than acknowledge what the people had voted for, Sulla decided instead to appeal to his troops' greed by saying, "Who do you think will win you more glory and goodies, me or Grandpa Marius?" And these men had to be honest with themselves. At this point, Sulla was the better general, and so they marched on Rome. And now we were in the middle of a minor civil war, and Marius and his son were on the run. The popularity of the elder Marius ensured that they were able to get some men to stand up for them, and these are most likely a lot of the same guys who had just voted to give the command over to the elder Marius. But this makeshift army was easily scattered by Sulla's men, and now both Mariuses were on the run. The plan was for the younger Marius to gather supplies at his father-in-law's estate and then make for Marius's estate, and the two would escape together on a ship at Ostia. However, the younger Marius ran into difficulties as he was being hunted and had to move cautiously. The next day, therefore, the elder Marius despaired of his son and decided to go on board ship by himself. And so the two men had very different odysseys. We won't get into what happens with the elder Marius. If you're interested in that, I'm sure I'll talk about it eventually. Otherwise, you can read the account in Plutarch's Life of Marius. As for the younger Marius, he was nearly nabbed by a mounted patrol looking for him, since he had been condemned by Sulla, but a quick-thinking, friendly farmer, who apparently preferred the Marians, helped him hide in a cart of melons, and simply mosey on past the patrol. He then paid a brief and almost certainly ill-advised visit to his wife Licenia to make sure she knew that he was okay, and then he found a ship of his own and reached Numidia with a small party. By contrast, his father, although he'd set out to sea earlier, ended up being shipwrecked in Italy. So, if anything, the younger Marius so far had the easier time of things, although that was about to change. During the Jugurthine War in the early 100s, Marius had finished off King Jugurtha and restored the rightful king of Numidia. That king, in turn, had given birth to Hiempsal II, who was the current crowned monarch. Hiempsal II was brand new to power, and about the same age as the younger Marius. And so at first, this was a warm reception. After all, Hiempsal II was well aware of what he owed to the elder Marius, and he probably therefore had some positive feelings about his son. That being said, he was a king first and foremost, and he knew that it would be irresponsible to simply join in on the side of the Marians when Sulla was in the ascendant. It was also most likely unwise to get involved in a Roman civil war, given that the Romans tended to not be terribly kind to people who were involved in the deaths of other Romans. And so, for reasons that are easily understood, Hiempsal II did not want to have to make a decision. So he stalled. And Marius, for that reason, wanted to leave. He realized this might be a waste of time. But when he went to leave, he found that the door was barred. Hiempsal, while smiling, would come up with increasingly improbable reasons why Marius and his friends needed to stay. We know, for instance, that Marius was here with his stepbrother, one of the two stepbrothers he had, among others, and that this party was detained. Most likely, they're starting to fall into despair a little bit, thinking that Hiempsal will strike a deal with one of Sulla's allies, have them arrested and taken in chains back to Rome. We don't actually know what Hiempsal was up to, but we know that he was weighing his options and looking out for the best interest of himself and his kingdom. In the meantime, Marius and his friends could do little except for most likely drink and pretend that they were on good terms with their host. Hiempsal had a number of concubines at court, and one of them developed a fancy for Marius. She came on to him, but he rejected her. Most likely, he was suspicious that she might be a spy, and he didn't want to make Hiempsal's job of monitoring him any easier. Eventually, however, he relented. He decided, perhaps out of lust or boredom, that what else was he realistically going to do? And so he began to sleep with the woman, and they started to really get close. At some point, he decided that he had to take a risk, and so he shared with her that he wanted to escape. She understood, and she agreed to help. And so she helped him to find a way out, and his whole party was eventually able to break out. We don't know if she went with him, so perhaps she remained as his mistress for the rest of his days. It's also possible that she was actually working for Hiempsal the whole time, and that by having Marius mount this secretive escape, Hiempsal was effectively once again giving himself plausible deniability. He didn't let Marius go. But at the same time, if Marius wins, he'd go to his dad and say, well, who do you think put her up to letting him out? That's another possibility. One thing I do wonder about is what ended up happening to this young woman. Did she become another Ariadne, abandoned by the man who seduced her and got her help? Or did she live on as his mistress? Or was she caught and executed? We'll never know, but that was one of the details in the story that I found myself wondering about the most. Escaping east into the Roman province of Africa, Marius stumbled upon a party of familiar-looking guys led by an even more familiar-looking old man. And it so happened that, serendipitously, he and his father ran into each other. on the same isolated beach. They embraced joyously, and they exchanged stories of all of the terrible things they had endured. But before they could get too comfortable, the elder Marius spotted a scorpion in the sand and declared that this was an ill omen and they needed to get on with it. And so they took ship together and began to venture back to Italy. Their first stop was on the island of Kirkina, right off the coast of Africa, and here they were very nearly captured by a Numidian patrol. After this, they were much more cautious, and according to our sources, they spent the whole winter at sea in order to try to evade capture. But, as Mark Haydn points out in his biography of the elder Marius, it's far more likely that they were able to hide out with friends somewhere on the coast of Africa, or perhaps, say, in a place like Sardinia. They had plenty of connections, and it's also worth mentioning that the elder Marius was someone who could never be completely counted out, and so even someone who might have never met him might be willing to kiss his ass for the winter in the unlikely event that he goes on to win the Civil War and is then able to lavish rewards upon them. So they were not roughing it out at sea. That would be unrealistic given the nature of sailing in the ancient world on the open waters. So we shouldn't imagine them bobbing around all winter. That's just not what happened. When the two Mariuses disembarked at Rome, or more likely somewhere near Ostia, they learned that their ally Cinna was raising forces to oppose the Sullans in Italy. Reporting to Cinna, they offered their services, and then Marius raised the banner for his retainers and allies to appear. According to Cassius Dio, this consisted mostly of gladiators and slaves, although exactly why gladiators and slaves were fans of Marius is far from clear. At any rate, though, they raised a number of men and began to march on Rome to seize power. During this time, due to the age of Marius, his son, Marius Minor, would have been the one doing the vast majority of the actual dirty work. Marius and Cinna rounded up and killed their suspected enemies, with again a lot of that dirty work most likely being performed by the younger Marius. And then they became consuls together, with the elder Marius becoming consul for the seventh and final time alongside of Cinna. Marius was then able to really honor his father and Cinna even more by presenting them with the head of a tribune who had spoken against them, while taking another offending tribune up to the Tarpeian Rock and hurling him down as if it were still the early Republic. The younger Marius was also, for whatever reason, able to ban two praetors as being enemies of the state and denied them fire and water. My guess would be that these two praetors were formerly the ones who had given a similar sentence to Marius and his father, and so he felt that it was his place to exact this revenge rather than leaving it to the official magistrates of the city. And so we already see that due to Marius's social position and his father's influence, that he was able to exercise power that was frankly inappropriate to someone who was technically a private citizen and not even a senator. We only have a handful of details for what Marius Minor was up to between 87, when he and his father helped to seize power, and 82. In 86, early in the year, the elder Marius passed away, and most likely his cause of death was that he had overexerted himself for a number of years without giving himself enough rest. By this point, he was nearly 70 years old, and he had really lived longer than he probably should have if we account for how hard he was pushing himself. At the funeral, no doubt, Marius the Younger spoke, and one of the attendees was none other than the Pontifex Maximus and ex-consul Quintus Mucius Scaevola Pontifex. This was well and good that he was showing his respect to the fallen Marius, but for some of Marius's partisans, it was too much to see him there, because he was a well-known supporter of Sulla, and some of them actually attempted to murder him on the spot to send him to the afterlife with their hero. Perhaps it was Marius the Younger who personally intervened and saved him. At any rate, we know that not long after this, perhaps because Licenia had passed away, Marius would actually arrange to marry one of Scivola's daughters. And perhaps his thinking was that by doing so he could win over Scivola's support and thus undermine the Sullans. If that was his thinking, it doesn't really seem to have worked. Either that or he simply never quite came to trust Scaevola. Really, because of his youth, Marius didn't have all that much to do. At least not compared with guys like Lucius Cornelius Cinna, who became the full leader of the faction after Marius's passing, and then when he himself passed away, the faction fell into the hands of the consul Gnaeus Papirius Carbo. The younger Marius was very much a presence, but because of his youth, he could not really be the head of this movement. By 83, Sulla had finished his war with Mithridates and recrossed the Adriatic to try conclusions with Carbo. 83 had ended in an indecisive outcome. Sulla had not been able to knock out Carbo, nor had Carbo been able to utilize superior numbers to overwhelm Sulla's men. The key advantage Sulla had is that he had men who had the combination of youth and experience. And in a military context, especially in something as skill-based as ancient warfare, the combination of youth and experience is a very difficult thing to defeat. The only thing Carbo could do was to try to make the numerical edge that he had so overwhelming that Sulla would be engulfed. And so, over the winter of 83 to 82, he decided to do a couple of things to bolster his position. First, he was somehow able to convince the Samnites that he would be their ally, whereas Sulla was their enemy. And that meant that he opened up a fairly large pool of recruits who had a distinct way of fighting. So this was important and bolstered his ranks as well as the morale of his men. Second, Carbo decided, to hell with the rules, we've already been giving people back-to-back offices anyway, let's do what's best for optics and recruitment. I need a colleague with a recognizable name beside me in the consulship. And so, Carbo decided to choose the 27-year-old Gaius Marius the Younger to be his colleague. Now, while the younger Marius didn't have his father's resume, he did have his name. And that was actually enough for a whole lot of veterans who were still on the sidelines and unwilling to commit to the cause for Carbo. But for the son of Gaius Marius, they were willing to strap on their old armor and polish their swords and show up. So now there were some old veterans showing up to help the Marians. And it must be said that Carbo had performed brilliantly that winter. He made exactly the moves he needed to make to bolster his position and give himself the best possible chance of winning. The fact that he ultimately lost should not distract from the fact that he actually did make the right moves here. For the campaign of 82, both the Marians and Sulla would field multiple field armies who would clash on different fronts. Pompey the Great had raised his father's veterans in Picenum. There was also a small army under Marcus Licinius Crassus fighting for Sulla. On the Marian side, there were also multiple commanders. Gaius Marius himself would be leading a full consular army, and he would be guarding the southeastern approach to Rome. So he had one of, if not the most important fronts. And most likely Carbo was willing to concede that to him simply because the veterans who had shown up to support him would bolster his army and perhaps give him the best chance of defeating Sulla, who was a talented and experienced commander. So although Marius himself had no actual command experience, if he had veterans with him, then that gave him more than any other commander on the Marian side. Sulla could be expected to march on Rome, so perhaps it was little surprise to anyone when Marius encountered Sulla on this approach vector. Before the battle started at Sacriportus, it looks like Marius had around 48,000 men total, and he was facing a smaller force under Sulla, but of course, Sulla's men had the experience. So, in theory, this battle could go either way. Although, again, armies that have that combination of youth and experience tend to prevail in a head-on clash. But a little bit of generalship and a little bit of luck, and that could be overcome. Except in this case, that is not going to happen. The night before the Battle of Sacriportus, the story goes, Sulla had a dream, where the elder Marius appeared to tell his son that the next day would be a terrible one. And so, although he woke to a morning that was full of rain and mud, Sulla was confident of victory and decided to fortify his camp. Marius saw this and thought that Sulla had made a fatal mistake. He knew that Sulla's men would be tired from having to dig in the mud, and so he decided to let them finish and then attack. Perhaps Marius didn't understand that Sulla's men were putting up an entrenchment that would help them in the battle. But, at any rate, Marius' strategy did have some merit to it, as his men were fresher going into the battle, which was always a good thing. Now, at first, it looked like this battle might end up being a close contest. After all, Marius' men were more numerous, they had more momentum, and they were fresher. But the battle was actually decided pretty early on, and Appian tells us that on the left flank of Marius' force, 5 cohorts and 2 cohorts of cavalry decided to leave the battle. So they panicked, or perhaps they were paid to do this, and they suddenly broke and ran, or at least left the field. And when that happened, this panicked the troops beside them and led to a general rout. And so, Marius' army was now in a precipitate flight back away from Sacriportus to the nearby city of Praeneste. Here, Marius and his men were storming toward the city, which was willing to admit them, until they saw that the Sullans were in hot pursuit, and feared that the Sullans would simply overrun the city and butcher everyone. So the locals actually slammed the gates shut and bar them, which leaves a whole lot of Marius' men out to hang, and these guys will be slaughtered. 25,000 men will just be butchered, another 8,000 are taken prisoner. As for Marius and the remainder of his men, some 15,000 or so, they will make it into the city and give it a pretty decent garrison. That being said, as a large field force, this army is now finished. And as things will turn out as the war goes along, this will have proven to be the decisive battle in a lot of ways. Marius Minor now found himself in possession of Praeneste with 15,000 men, but no food. At least not any food beyond what would normally be there, so he was not at all stocked up and ready for a siege. Yet, by spring, perhaps early summer, that's exactly the situation. And so now he is at the mercy of his fellow Marian commanders to come bail him out. In the meantime, Sulla decides that while Marius has suffered a severe defeat, that he still has too many men left to risk an assault, and that a siege will also take months. So he leaves one of his legates behind, Quintus Lucretius Ophala, to oversee that, while he goes on to fight in other areas. This operation will last for months. The city won't fall until November, but we don't know all that many details about the daily occurrences at Praeneste. Appian says that at one point Marius made a concerted effort to break out, gathering together all of his men and field artillery, and making repeated sallies against Lucretius's lines. But ultimately he was not able to bust out. We don't know whether this is accurate or not. Appian is not much of a military historian, and typically sallies do not go for 4 days uninterrupted. It can be said, however, that Carbo recognized the importance of Marius' surviving force and also the symbolic importance of Marius to the cause, and so he and the other commanders would try multiple relief attempts, But none of these relief attempts actually made it through to the city, much less spraying Marius. In fact, a couple of these got ambushed, and Sulla, Pompey, and a couple of the other Sullan commanders scored some victories over these would-be relief columns. So in many ways, Praeneste was a trap of sorts for Marius and his allies, because they kept trying to go there to spring out Marius's army, and every time they tried it, Sulla anticipated their move and made them pay in blood for that decision. So this was a pretty dire situation that only got worse over time, and despite the best efforts of Carbo and all of the other commanders, no one proved to be able to get through and help out Marius. Other than going hungry and vainly waiting for relief to arrive, Marius the Younger had little to do at Praeneste, and so he had time to think and stew. Who was really to blame for his failure here? It must be those damn Sullans who stayed in Rome. Maybe they were giving information to Sulla the whole time. And certainly, if they had been more loyal to his father and to Cinna and Carbo and himself, then perhaps the cause would be stronger, and they maybe even could have avoided war. So, at any rate, he was going to leave this world in a violent way, so why not take a few assholes with him? Accordingly, Marius wrote instructions to the praetor in Rome, Lucius Junius Brutus Damasippus, and ordered the execution of his political enemies. So he simply made a wish list, sent it on, and it was honored. And so Damasippus did go after all the men on the list. Now, some of them were able to evade the blades of Damasippus's assassins, but a number of other prominent men were caught and destroyed, including Marius's own father-in-law, Scaevola. And this is significant because never before in the history of the Republic had a sitting Pontifex Maximus been murdered. And so many people who were tracing the moral decline and the death of norms in the Republic will point to this as one of the many steps along the road to ruin that were taken in this period. So Marius the Younger has some notoriety there for ordering the murder of a Pontifex Maximus, who was supposed to be sacrosanct. On November 1st, 82 BCE, the Marian forces in Rome clashed with Sulla at the Battle of the Colline Gate. Reports were coming in all day at Praeneste, which was only maybe 20 or so miles away. At first, it appeared that perhaps the Marians would win the battle after all, which would inevitably be followed by a relief army at long last. However, reports continued to come in, and it was revealed that although the early going of the battle had indeed gone poorly for Sulla, in the end he was able to prevail, and he was now the master of Rome itself. And so, the citizens of Praeneste, who had already suffered plenty on behalf of Marius, decided that it was time to give up the cause. So they surrendered. Marius himself, however, was not completely defeated yet. He knew from past experience that it was impossible to break away, that it was possible to evade patrols and live the fight another day. And so he decided to try to do that yet again. And so he and a couple friends went into the underground sewer of the city and attempted to work their way out of a drainage ditch. Unfortunately for him, Lucretius had already thought of that. And so there were guards stationed at the entrances to every sewer. So, despairing of escape, Lucretius and his friends decided that the best path forward was ending their own lives. And so he and a friend resolved to run upon each other's sword, and this, as it often was the case, did not go all that well, as his friend died on Marius' sword, but when Marius ran upon his friend's sword, he was merely wounded. And a gut wound is incredibly painful and can take a long time to kill you, and so Marius had to be finished off by one of his slaves. All told, he had failed to reach Solar City. It was a bad day for dog meat, and a red letter day for the Radigators. And thus, Gaius Marius the Younger died, surrounded by human waste. Not long after Marius' suicide, Lucretius' search parties found his body, and the legate then decided to have Marius' head removed and sent off to Sulla. Sulla had not yet arrived at Praeneste, he was still in Rome, and when he got the head, he looked it over carefully. And then, addressing the head as if he was Hamlet in the Shakespeare play, he said, "You first have to learn to row before you take the tiller," which of course is a reference to Marius' youth and inexperience. And in order to let everybody in Rome know that the man who was the living embodiment of the Marian cause was now no longer with us, Sulla decided to put his head up on display in the Forum. And so this would take away the remaining fight in the hearts of men who might prefer Marius. So in Sulla's mind, this was a major step forward and a great moment in his career. For the people of Rome, this seemed like a pretty predictable move, and they didn't yet know that Sulla had absolute bloodshed on his mind, so that revelation wouldn't come quite yet. But for now, Gaius Marius is dead, and the civil war, for all practical intents and purposes, has been won by Sulla, who will shortly become dictator and then go off on his reign of terror. If you want to learn more about that, I suggest you watch my recent video on Lucretius Ophala, who helped Sulla win the civil war, only to arguably become his first victim. So if you're curious about that, go watch the video on him. As I said at the outset of this video, I tend to view Gaius Marius the Younger as a less successful and less lucky version of Pompey the Great. Both of them have famous fathers and inherit the loyalty of their father's troops, and then both of them are able to leverage that to gain political power at a young age. Marius, of course, was consul at 27, whereas Pompey was an independent army commander at about 23. Of course, Pompey sided with Sulla and was on the winning side. Pompey almost certainly was also a better general, although, to be fair to Marius, he only fought one battle, and it was against a far more experienced commander, and he lost. And so, it's really hard to say how much potential he might have had. Under other circumstances, who knows what Marius the Younger might have become? We have to remember, too, with our sources, that they tend to have a very clear bias. With the exception of Plutarch, who seems to favor the populares, most ancient writers have a favoritism for the optimates or boni. They tend to look more favorably upon the men who defend the property regime than they do upon the men who play to the crowd. And while they do make some exceptions for guys like Marius the Elder because of his military successes, they have very little time for Marius the Younger, and they smear him as being unusually bloodthirsty and vicious. But I really see no reason to think that he was any worse than, say, Pompey, and certainly not worse than Sulla or his own father. He was a product of an era when all of the norms of Rome were out the window. They're fighting for survival, and they believe that their enemies are traitors to everything that is good and right about the Republic. Marius was simply acting in accord with the zeitgeist of his age, and that zeitgeist was particularly nasty. Marius' death at the age of 27 is actually a pretty significant thing for the history of the Republic. So not only is he on the losing side of this war, and by dying when he does, he ensures that the Civil War for the most part is over, unless you count Sertorius' continuation in Spain. But also, this means that with him gone, And then with Sulla's prescriptions, there's now an opening for a new preeminent leader of the populares. And while there were men who were more senior, it left a vacuum that was filled ultimately by Gaius Julius Caesar. Had Marius somehow survived, then he might have taken over in Spain. Or somehow he might have found a way to get pardoned, and then he would have occupied a lot of that space. But as it was, what was once the Marian faction would ultimately come over and work with young Gaius Julius Caesar. So this is a very important person to pass away when he does. It's also worth mentioning that Marius, the younger that is one of the major figures in Colleen McCulloch's novels about ancient Rome. So Fortune's Favorite is the first in that series, and in that novel, Marius the Younger features fairly prominently. So if you're looking for a little pop culture representation for a minor figure in Roman history, then this would be a place to look, especially if you have an interest in learning more about Marius Minor. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. Remember, you can find my Patreon in the link in the description below. And I also do live streams almost every week, so stay tuned for those. In the near future, I'll be coming back to you with a video on Manius Aquilius, who died horrifically, as did so many of these guys. So until then, have a good day, and I will see you around in the near future.